You know, if one thing is good, two of those things has got to be better, right? I mean, who doesn't like two cookies or two scoops of ice cream? I know I do. You know, my wife Christy keeps saying two puppies are better than one. But you know, I don't always want two of a thing. I mean, I certainly don't want two femur fractures. But how about defibrillation? If one defibrillator is good, certainly two must be better, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about dual sequence defibrillation. This is a topic we have hit several times here on the podcast. As a matter of fact, the last time we talked about it, we talked about the pilot study of the DOSED VF trial. This was a randomized control trial looking at dual sequence defibrillation versus vector change versus standard defibrillation. We had to wait, oh so patiently, plus or minus the patient part, for the full trial. Well, the full study is now out. I've got it, I've read it, I have thoughts, and I want to share them with you. We'll be right back.
What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here's your host, Dr. Jeff Jarvis.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Welcome back to another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, where we shine the bright light of science in the darkness of EMS clinical practice. Today, we're going to shine that bright light on dual sequence defibrillation. But before I get to that, I have to say just one word about our last episode. When we finished up that episode, Rimley and I were sitting there in the bar in Mexico, and well, I opened my mouth and I talked about the Astros in the World Series, and I said I sure hope I didn't jinx it. Obviously, that was before the last game of the World Series. Well, I didn't jinx it, baby. Go Stros, go. I just got to say that. For all my Philly fans out there, great series, but I'm really proud of my Stros. With that out of the way, let's get back to the DOSED VF trial. So the citation for this paper is by Sheldon Cheskes and his colleagues. The title, Defibrillation Strategies for Refractory Ventricular Fibrillation. This was published this month in the New England Journal of Medicine, 2022, obviously. And I'm really excited about it. As I mentioned, I've been waiting for this paper for a long time. So let's talk some background here. Now, I know I've hit on some of these papers before on the pod, but let's just do a previously heard on segment here. So dual sequence defibrillation, long history in the electrophysiology labs, not so much in the field. As a matter of fact, the first time I heard about this in the field was from our colleagues in Wake County. They published a paper titled Double Sequential External Defibrillation in Out-of-Hospital Refractory Ventricular Fibrillation, a report of 10 cases. This was by Jose Cabañas, Brent Myers, Jeff Williams, Val DeMaio, and Mike Bachman. It was published Prehospital Emergency Care 2015, and as the title suggests, this was a small sample. We had 10 patients, they used it, they got patients out of EFib more often. Now ultimately, if I remember correctly, there were no survivors. They didn't really report on outcomes, and that wasn't the point. It was to introduce the concept. Now, perhaps there is a survival advantage, but with only 10 cases, it would have to be a massive difference to be evident. Now, several agencies adopted this. There were two papers that reported on their experience with this. One was from San Antonio, one was from Houston. They were both case-matched studies, so cases matched with controls. So the citations for these papers were Mapp and colleagues. This was the San Antonio paper. The title was Prehospital Double Sequential Defibrillation, a Matched Case Control Study, published in Academic Emergency Medicine in 2019. Now, the Houston study was by Beck, Ostermayer, and colleagues, including our friend Henry Wang. This was titled The Effectiveness of Prehospital Dual Sequential Defibrillation for Refractory Ventricular Fibrillation and Ventricular Tachycardia, Cardiac Arrest. Whew, they like them some words down in Houston. This was published in Prehospital Emergency Care 2019, and the bottom line on this is they showed no patient-oriented benefit, but there were some important methodologic problems with these papers. Specifically, we don't know why the patients who got dual sequential defibrillation did, and we don't really know when. Particularly in the Houston paper, it looks like they were done toward the end of the code as a bit of a Hail Mary. So we can match two groups based on potential confounders that we know about and we have recorded information on. Things like age and sex and bystander CPR, but there is always the potential for a lurking confounder, meaning this confounder that we don't know about and we certainly don't measure, that influences why one group of people get dual sequence and the other doesn't. And perhaps that confounder is the thing that makes the difference. So what we really needed was a randomized control trial. And fortunately, that's what we got with the DOSED VF trial. We talked about the pilot results for this study in a few episodes back. We talked about it. And that was done primarily to make sure they can get the assigned treatment strategy to patients a majority of the time. And they did that. They also wanted to make sure that it was safe, and it turns out it was. But we couldn't draw any conclusions from that small sample size about what the ultimate outcomes are going to be. We had to wait. And I don't know about y'all, but I hate waiting. So I was really, really glad when I got a text from Emily saying, hey, the paper's out. Did you see it? And then I got about 50 other texts saying essentially the same thing. So let's go through. Here's the general methods. This is a 3-armed randomized control trial. They took patients and randomized them to either double sequential or dual sequential defibrillation, vector change defibrillation, or standard defibrillation. The population they studied, these were adults 18 or over, and they enrolled them in 6 Canadian EMS systems in the Ontario province. These were non-traumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrest with a presumptive cardiac etiology. They also had to have an initial rhythm of ventricular fibrillation on arrival by fire or EMS, and they had to still be in that ventricular fibrillation rhythm despite 3 standard defibrillation shocks with 2 minutes of CPR in between each shock. So pretty much normal stuff, standard approach that I think most of us approach to our cardiac arrest. So pretty representative sample, I would say. They did exclude patients who had out-of-hospital DNRs, who had an etiology of cardiac arrest that was not presumptive cardiac. Now, those are the things like drownings and overdoses and hypothermia. They also didn't enroll prisoners or pregnant people, all the things that you would typically expect to exclude. So the control was standard defibrillation. So their standard defibrillation was an anterior and lateral pad placement. That was what they started defibrillating with, and they did that for the next 2 shocks. The intervention was dual sequence defibrillation, and then the other intervention was vector change. So let's talk a little bit about those interventions. So here is the standard defib, anterior, lateral, and if you're not watching on YouTube, the anterior was in the right upper part of the chest, lateral, left lower part of the chest, slightly lateral, right around where your V3, V4 leads would be. That was standard defibrillation. If they went to the vector change, those pads were removed in a choreographed fashion, and new pads were placed in the anterior position, which is essentially where the lateral pad placement would have been. So left lower chest beneath the breast, again over where your V3, V4, V5 leads would be, with the posterior pad going just below and medial to the left scapula. Now, if they were randomized to the dual sequence external defibrillation or DSED group, they left the original pads on, so the anterior right upper quadrant of the chest and the lateral pad on the left lower, again over the V3, V4, V5 area. And then they put a second group of pads on in the anterior posterior. Posterior is in the same position as vector change, just medial and inferior to the left scapula. But the anterior pad placement, because there is already a pad over on the left lower quadrant, went to the left of the sternum just above that lateral pad placement. So that anterior posterior might be a little bit different in both a vector change and dual sequence that you might have thought about. I think a lot of us probably put that anterior pad for anterior posterior a little bit higher up on the chest. So I think it's important that we understand what those pad placements were. So they used two types of monitors here throughout the systems. There was the Zoll X series and the LifePak 15, so Physio Controller Striker. As you know, those use different energy settings. The Zoll was done to go 120, 150, 200 for the first 3 shocks. Everything after that, regardless of how, whether it was single, vector change, or dual, everything after that was 200. The LifePak 15 went 200, 300, 360, and everything thereafter was 360. So that covers the intervention, both arms of the intervention, and the comparator or control. What was the outcome? Well, their primary outcome was survival to hospital discharge. Then there were secondary outcomes, as you would expect. The big secondary outcomes were termination of ventricular fibrillation, ROSC, and survival to hospital discharge neurologically intact. And they used a modified Rankin score of 2 or less to indicate functional neurologic survival. A little more about the methods. This was a cluster randomized RCT, and the clusters were based around the paramedic service. This was also a crossover study, so every agency, and remember there were 6 of them, had at least one block of time where they were using each of the 3 arms. So each block would be 6 months, and they would do 6 months of standard defibrillation, 6 months of vector change, 6 months of dual sequence, and the order of those would be randomized. All of the 6 agencies did at least one block of each. The vast majority did multiple blocks of each one. Only one agency did only one block. So that's a crossover. They did the pilot study from March of 2018 to September of 2019, and then the next day they flipped the switch and continued with enrollment for the full trial. That went September 9th to May of 2022. So far so good. And then the world stopped rotating because COVID hit. So initially they took a break in April of 2020. That break lasted until September of 2020. And remember back to what you were doing at the outbreak of the pandemic. We really didn't know what to do. We saw our colleagues in Italy and Spain and New York, and they were telling us people were dying left and right. This was no joke. This was the pandemic we were all worried about. There were aerosolizing procedures and CPR and intubation, definitely aerosolizing. We need to take a time out and figure out how we can safely respond to these patients while keeping our responders safe. I don't know about y'all, but certainly in my area, we threw everything that we ever knew about responding to cardiac arrest out the window. In retrospect, maybe we should not have done that. And again, in retrospect, I think it'll be years before we get back to where we were before the plague. But by September 20th, 2020, they had sort of figured things out, and then they resumed enrollment. And then they terminated the study early. They terminated the study early in May of 2022, and they did it because of COVID-induced staffing shortages, and those staffing shortages were having an impact on response times. Now, that's what they say in the paper, and I get it, makes sense to me. Judging my own response to COVID and seeing the impact it's had on our system and recruitment and retention and well-being, what I can see, reading between the lines, pure speculation, I haven't talked to anybody up there, but certainly if I were trying to carry out a randomized controlled trial, asking medics to randomize these patients, do this extra stuff that includes paperwork at a time when they are crispy as hell, when they're already burned out, I think that might be a bit much. And that's the reason that I would terminate it. I don't know if that's what happened there, but I think it's certainly reasonable. I think all of us involved in EMS through this time recognize the challenges that are there. So what was the impact of early termination? Well, the thing we have to worry about is, assuming there's nothing glaring, no safety things found in the intermittent reporting, we have to worry about sample size. Their sample size was calculated to need 930 patients in total. That's 310 in each arm. And this was based on an assumed baseline survival rate for these patients, the ones with presumptive cardiac etiology in VFib. Their baseline assumed survival was 12%, and they assumed, based on prior data, that they would see an increase with either of the interventions of 8%. And based on that and their calculations to figure out 80% strength, an alpha value, they needed 930 patients. Now, a couple of things. That was based on an assumed survival rate of 12%. Their actual survival rate, if we use the standard defibrillation group, the control group as baseline, was a little higher than that, 13.3, but pretty much spot on. Now, they ended up with a little bit over 400 patients. That was 136 in the standard defib group, 144 in vector change, and 125 in dual sequence. So let's talk a little bit about their statistical methods. Obviously, we're going to come back and talk about the potential impact that that early termination had. So they were going to use a generalized linear equation. That's basically a regression analysis that accounts for clustering between different agencies. They adjusted the results for age, sex, and bystander CPR. Now, the interesting thing, at least interesting to a nerd like me, is that they proposed to report those results as adjusted odds ratios. And then in the manuscript, what they say, either in the manuscript or their supplemental analysis, what they say is they change that to adjusted risk ratios or relative risk at the request of the New England Journal of Medicine. So I read that and I went, I don't think I adequately understand the difference between a risk ratio and an odds ratio. So off I went, I dove into some literature and did what I usually do when I have methodology questions. I texted Dr. Crow, and she sent me a reference. So the paper that she sent, the title was Common Pitfalls in Statistical Analysis, Odds versus Risk. This was by Dr. Ranganathan. The journal is Perspectives in Clinical Research. This was published in 2015. It turns out this Common Pitfalls in Statistical Analysis is a series of articles. And after I read this, it's only about 2-3 pages long. It really is a just wham bam, thank you ma'am, here's the nuts and bolts, what you need to know. It seems to me it was written for clinicians as opposed to statisticians. So I ate this up. I downloaded as many of these articles as I can. I'll be reading them in the future. But the bottom line here is that odds is calculated differently than risk. So let's go over that really quickly. An odds is the ratio of the occurrence rate, how often did it happen, divided by how often it did not happen, or the non-occurrence rate. That's the odds. Risk, on the other hand, is the occurrence rate. So the numerator is the same, but the denominator is different. In risk, it is the occurrence rate over the sum of the occurrence rate and the non-occurrence rate. So in other words, risk is how often the thing happens in the population, and odds are how often it happens in a group divided by how often it does not happen. So that's odds versus risk. An odds ratio, as we said before, is just the ratio of the odds. So that's now comparing the odds in two groups and dividing them by each other. Risk ratio is the same thing. It takes the risk in two groups and combines them together as a ratio. Now, relative risk rate is the same thing as risk ratio, so those two terms are used synonymously. For both of them, a risk ratio or an odds ratio of 1 means no difference. If you have a 95% confidence interval that crosses 1, that means it is not significant. If the 95% confidence interval is entirely on one side or the other of 1, then there is a difference. For both, if the ratio is above 1, it's higher odds or higher risk. If it's below 1, it's lower odds or lower risk. Now, odds ratio and risk ratio, those two things are not always the same. So if you have a very rare occurrence, so basically the occurrence rate is less than 10%, your odds ratio and risk ratio are going to be very close, and you can use them interchangeably. But as your occurrence rate gets more common, above 10%, those numbers, the values of odds ratio and risk ratio, diverge, and as you get a more common occurrence, the odds ratio will exaggerate the size of the impact from risk ratio. So your odds ratio will show more of an impact than risk ratio. So if you are looking at something that's very rare, pretty much indistinguishable. If you're looking at something not so rare, you really should use risk ratio. So that is what I have learned from my little dive into common pitfalls of statistical analysis. Hopefully that was useful for you. So what else do we know about their methods here? They did an intention to treat analysis and a fragility index. And remember, a fragility index just means how many positive outcomes would have to have been negative to change the outcome of a trial. So a very fragile trial would have 1. So if one positive outcome was actually negative, then it would not have been a significant result, statistically anyway. All right, so let's talk about the results. The first thing we need to get out of the way, monitor manufacturers have been saying do not do dual sequence defibrillation because it will fry our monitors. They will be killed. I think that's kind of crappy crap, but they looked at it, they studied it, and it is really important to know that no defibrillators were harmed in this experiment. No damage to the defibrillators. I think hopefully we can move on here. One thing I will say is that this is not dual simultaneous defibrillation, it's dual sequential, and that's important theoretically to keep the lawyers happy for, keeping your warranty valid. But it's also important for the theoretic reason that this might work. We can talk about that in a bit. So it's sequential, you shock and then shock a second later. So as you would expect from a randomized control trial, we ended up with 3 pretty evenly balanced groups. Again, the numbers, standard defib 136, vector change 144, dual sequence 125, the age, the sex, bystander cardiac arrest, bystander witnessed rate, public location, median response time, all pretty equal. And there is table 2 that you can look up that gives a whole lot more information, specifically looking at the quality of CPR. We like that. That really is important. And it turns out it was pretty equal across all the groups. Compression rate, interruption, these things, this is good to know, pretty equal. They also looked at the amount of epinephrine, the time in cardiac arrest, all these things, pretty standard. So let's get right to the results that we care about. This is found in table 3 of the paper. Primary outcome, survival to hospital discharge. In the standard group, 13.3% survival. In the vector change, 21.7% survival. And in the dual sequence group, 30.4% survival. Now, their planned analysis was to compare each of the intervention groups not to themselves, but to standard defib. And what did we find? Remember, again, this is adjusted risk ratios or adjusted relative risk. The dual sequence versus standard was 2.21, so 121% increased risk, if you will, of successful survival to hospital discharge with dual sequence. The 95% confidence interval did not cross 1, so it was significant. And then we look at the vector change versus standard, also a significant result. 1.71 adjusted relative risk, 71% increased risk of survival to hospital discharge. That's their primary outcome. This is a positive trial. We see improved survival with both dual sequence and vector change. Well, let's take a look at the secondary outcomes. Termination of VFib was higher with the dual sequence and with vector change, as you would expect. ROSC was higher with dual sequence, 1.72. Turns out it was not significantly different with vector change, which is sort of interesting since there was no difference in ROSC, but there was more survival. Now what that tells me, and it was barely non-significant, 0.97 to 1.99, that suggests to me, because the point estimate was above 1, that perhaps if they had been able to complete the trial, get their 930 patients, that confidence interval may have been a little higher and may have been to the right of 1. Then survival functionally neurologically intact, MRS of 2 or lower. We saw 11% in the standard defib group, 16% in the vector change, and 27% in the dual sequence. So the adjusted risk ratio here was 2.21 with dual sequence versus standard. That was a significant difference. And with vector change, we saw 1.48, but because the confidence interval crossed 0 from 0.81 to 2.71, that was not a statistically significant difference. And again, I suspect this is because we have a wide confidence interval because the study was terminated early. So, bottom line, dual sequence defibrillation improved survival to hospital discharge and neurologically intact survival at discharge. Vector change improved survival to hospital discharge, but did not improve neurologically intact survival. All right, so what is my take on this? Well, number one, I think these results are real. I think they're significant, and I think they are plausible. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to understand exactly how it works. I don't. But it does mean that it certainly seems to work. I would obviously like to see this study confirmed and duplicated because the heart of science is replication. But this is the best study that we've had to date, and I think it's probably the best study we're going to get for a while because I'm not sure we're going to be able to fund a duplicate study. All right, so what do I think about this early termination of the study? Do I think it impacted the results? Well, it certainly could have. Now, what we would expect typically when we see an early termination is that there is no difference, and statistically we don't think enrolling the rest of the population of the planet is going to get us to a difference because there's just none, or it is so small that we're not going to be able to determine it. So typically speaking, when we terminate a study early, we see there is no difference, and that is confusing because maybe there would have been if we enrolled more patients. But that's not the situation we have here. They terminated early and still showed a difference, which means that the difference is large enough to be detected even with a smaller sample size. So that's important. Now, it is possible that the size of the effect may be smaller if we'd enrolled more patients, but I don't think it would be enough to switch the direction of the results. If we'd enrolled more patients, we certainly would have tighter confidence intervals, and I suspect that would be what we need to see significant results in the vector change group for ROSC and for neurologically intact survival. But the bottom line is, since we were still able to show positive results, despite early termination, I think this is real. Now, again, there is a plausible mechanism. So what we know is that the heart sits in the chest, the right ventricle is in front of the left ventricle is actually posterior to the right, and where we have our normal anterior lateral pad placement, the left ventricle is further away from the vector between the two pads. That means that we might not be able to defibrillate all of the fibrillating tissue, particularly in the apex of the left ventricle. Now, if there is a little nidus of fibrillation left after defib, then that can be, again, the nidus for refibrillation, so that you continue to repropagate fibrillation. So how can we terminate that? Well, one answer is, why don't we move the pads more in line with the left ventricle? So go anterior and posterior, and then get that posterior pad closer to the left ventricle. Therefore, we might be able to more fully defibrillate all of the myocardial tissue. So that's one mechanism, and that's what the vector change group was designed to look at. The other mechanism is maybe we need more energy. Well, clearly dual sequence, boom, boom, gives you double the energy, but maybe it's not about how much energy there is, but that slight delay in defibrillation, maybe that's what we need. And maybe that in combination with the vector change is what's really getting it. So the way that would work is the first defibrillation, anterior to lateral, knocks out, and I'm making these numbers up here, say knocks out 95% of the fibrillating myocardium, but that last 10%, or maybe it's 2%, I don't know what the percentage is, that then starts to fibrillate and propagate fibrillation through the ventricles. And then before it really has a chance to get going, we hit it with a second defibrillation with more energy from a different vector. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe that first defibrillation really primes the myocardium for a successful second defibrillation. The bottom line is we don't know for sure, and this trial can't tell us exactly what the mechanism it is. And I'll tell you, as a clinician, I'm less concerned about what the exact mechanism is. As someone who's curious, I would love to know. It would really help and can benefit maybe future therapies. So I think it's important that we keep looking into this. But I'm less bothered by not knowing, because ultimately we're seeing that it works. So this is what I refer to as the bumblebee effect. Now, what I mean by that is physicists, at least on Google, say bumblebees aren't supposed to be able to fly. I'm less concerned about how they actually manage to fly, because I can see them flying. And we can take repeated measurements, and sure enough, they fly. So we know they fly even if we don't understand the mechanism. We know from this trial that dual sequential external defibrillation improves survival. Do we know the exact mechanism? No. But I'm less concerned, even though curious, less concerned about the mechanism than I am the results. So that's my bottom line. I would love to hear what y'all think. What are you going to do in your system? Is this something you're already doing and you're going to change? Geez, I hope not. Or is this something you weren't doing but you're going to? Let me know, and let me know what you think about the operational challenges of dual sequence defibrillation in your system. You can hit me up on Twitter at Dr. Jeff Jarvis. That's assuming Twitter still exists when this comes out. You can always email me at jeff.jarvis@flightbridgeed.edu, or you can hit me at my new email address, jjarvis@medstar911.org. So I am recording this in late November. We're through with Thanksgiving. That means God will no longer kill a kitten if you start playing Christmas carols or put your decorations up. So if you celebrate, get at it. Hopefully everyone is going to have a jolly time and have a very, very happy holiday season. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Take care, y'all.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the FlightBridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.